The air inside the dimly lit restaurant felt heavy with tension. Dora Milanese stood behind the polished bar, her fingers gripping the bottle of wine she had just opened, her senses heightened. It was a quiet night, but something was different. The usual hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the faint chatter of clinking cutlery were strangely muted, as though the room itself had drawn in a breath and held it. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's go back to hours before, where it all started. The restaurant had always been a place of quiet elegance, a sanctuary for those who craved a fine meal and an even finer glass of wine. The soft glow of hanging pendant lights bounced off the marble countertops, casting a warm light that contrasted with the cool shadows of the evening. Dora, a bartender with a sharp eye and quicker instincts, had been working here long enough to know the ebb and flow of the crowd. But tonight, it felt different and tense. As the clock ticked toward the late hour, Dora's attention lingered on the entrance, feeling the subtle shift in the atmosphere. And then he walked in. Geraldo Arcuri. He was not someone you forgot, not someone whose presence went unnoticed. With his broad shoulders, dark beard, and heavily tattooed arms, he had the kind of appearance that demanded immediate attention. There was a danger about him, something raw, something that carried weight, even in a room full of well-dressed men and women. Geraldo Arcuri didn't just enter a room, he commanded it. Dora's gaze flicked to his table. The usual clink of silverware ceased for just a moment, as his associates followed him into the space. There was no grand entrance, no show, just the palpable feeling of power that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Her pulse quickened, and her senses sharpened. Arcuri was a man who commanded respect, or fear, and Dora knew it. She had seen him before. He was a regular, a fixture of the high-stakes crowd that frequented the restaurant's backroom for private meetings. But tonight felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, as though some unseen storm was brewing. Dora wasn't sure why, but something felt wrong. A shift, a subtle change, deep in her bones. She felt the weight of it in her chest, the unease that she couldn't quite shake. Her focus remained on him as he made his way to the corner of the room, where his usual table awaited. As she moved to pour a glass of wine for a nearby patron, she caught sight of him again, his hand lifting the glass toward his lips. The sound of the wine, swirling in the glass, broke through the silence like a distant warning bell. Dora felt a sudden coldness seize her heart. A faint, sharp, metallic scent curled up into the air, and her body tensed. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but the longer she stood there, the stronger it became. Her mind raced as she inhaled deeply, her senses straining. Cyanide, the unmistakable scent of death. She knew it instantly, the very scent her father had taught her to recognize. Her father, a chemist, a man who had spent his life studying poisons, teaching her to detect what most couldn't. A skill she had never once thought she would need. But now, standing behind the bar, watching Geraldo Arcuri's large hand clutch the glass, Dora realized it was the very thing that could save his life. Her heart skipped a beat. There was no time. She had mere seconds before Arcuri, a man whose power rivaled the city's most dangerous figures, would take that first sip. It would only take a single moment, and that single moment could mean life or death. Without thinking, Dora moved. Her body acted on instinct, honed over years of training, years of working in this restaurant, a place where every second mattered. Reaching across the bar, her fingers curled around his wrist, pulling the glass from his hand just before it reached his lips. The room seemed to stop. The air felt thick, charged with a kind of suspended disbelief. Dora's hands were trembling, her heart racing, but she kept her gaze steady as she locked eyes with Geraldo Arcuri. His expression was a mixture of shock and confusion, as if he had never been interrupted in such a way before. The intensity of his gaze was enough to send a shiver down her spine, but Dora didn't flinch. Her grip tightened on his arm, and she could feel the cold sweat on her palms. "You're not drinking that," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Geraldo's eyes narrowed, his lips twisting into a mixture of suspicion and anger. He didn't say a word. His gaze, piercing and unrelenting, remained fixed on her as if trying to read her every thought. The seconds stretched on, a heavy silence hanging in the air. Dora, still holding the glass, felt the weight of the moment, of what she had just done, and knew that there was no turning back. The reality of the situation slammed into her with full force. She had just saved the life of one of the most dangerous men in the city, and now she would have to live with whatever consequences came next. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of conversation slowly resumed in the restaurant, the world returning to its usual rhythm, but Dora felt everything shift. Geraldo slowly set the glass back down on the bar, his fingers brushing lightly against hers, and he didn't break eye contact. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough to tell her he knew exactly what she had done and why. "You're a sharp one," Geraldo said finally, his voice low and measured, still carrying the weight of power. He didn't seem angry now. Instead, there was an edge to his words, something calculating. "What do you think you're doing, bartender?" Dora's heart raced as she took a deep breath. The tension in her chest didn't ease, not even for a second. Her mind screamed for her to run, to walk away, to escape before the situation got worse. But something inside her, something that had always been there deep in her gut, told her she couldn't. She couldn't just turn away. The years of frustration, of unfulfilled dreams and broken promises seemed to collide in that moment. Her father had taught her to trust her instincts, to never turn a blind eye to danger, no matter how dark it was. And now, with Geraldo Arcuri standing before her, she realized that she wasn't just a bartender anymore. She was part of something much bigger, something much darker. "I'm just trying to keep you alive, Mr. Arcuri," Dora said quietly, the words slipping from her mouth before she could think better of them. Geraldo's eyebrow twitched, a flicker of something dangerous passing behind his eyes. "Alive?" he echoed, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You think you saved me? Or is this some kind of game you're playing?" Dora hesitated, but the weight of the moment pressed in, forcing her to make a decision she hadn't prepared for. She could feel the tension between them, sharp and thick, as though the entire restaurant was holding its breath. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the moment shifted. Geraldo's gaze softened, and he stepped back, as if deciding something. His lips curled into a small, amused smile. "Interesting," he murmured, his voice now laced with amusement. "I'll be watching you, bartender." Dora remained silent, her heart still pounding in her chest as she slowly nodded, her thoughts spinning with the enormity of what had just happened. She had saved him, yes, but in doing so, she had crossed into a world she knew nothing about, a world of power, crime, and deadly consequences. The night, which had begun like any other, had just changed her life forever. And as Geraldo Arcuri turned away, heading back to his seat, Dora's mind raced. She had only just begun to realize what she had gotten herself into. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't turn back now. The game had begun. Dora's fingers still gripped the stem of the wine glass, the weight of her actions sinking in. As the soft clinking of glasses returned to the room, the hum of conversation started up again, but it felt different. It felt thin, fragile, as if everything might shatter at the slightest wrong move. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, her breath shallow, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had to stay sharp, to think fast. The man in front of her wasn't just any regular customer. Geraldo Arcuri was a mafia boss, a kingpin, a man who'd made his name with fear and violence. He wouldn't forgive an act of defiance so easily. Geraldo's eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. His glare was as sharp as a blade, piercing her with the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. His fingers tightened around the glass, and for a split second, Dora wondered if he was going to slam it down on the bar, shatter the crystal in fury. His tattooed arm flexed beneath the sleeve of his black jacket, the intricate designs on his skin seeming to come alive as he leaned in closer, the scent of expensive cologne mixing with the tension in the air. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was low, controlled, but the anger behind it was unmistakable. The muscle in his jaw twitched. He wasn't used to being stopped, especially not by someone like her. Dora swallowed hard, trying to suppress the flutter of panic that threatened to rise in her throat. She had seconds to cover her tracks, to make sure this didn't escalate into something she wouldn't be able to walk away from. Her fingers tightened around the stem of the glass, feeling the slight tremor in her hand, and forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm saving your life," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the firestorm of fear and uncertainty swirling in her mind. Geraldo's eyebrows arched, his confusion more evident than his rage for the briefest moment. "Saving my life?" he repeated, as if the concept itself was foreign to him. He glanced down at the glass in her hand, then back at her. His voice hardened. "You think you know better than me what's good for me?" "I don't know what's good for you," Doris said, her voice unwavering. "But I know what's in that glass, and it's not wine." Her heart was still thumping in her chest, but she willed herself to remain calm. She couldn't let the fear take over now, not when everything hung in the balance. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The seconds ticked by like hours, each one stretching the silence further. It was almost as if he was trying to decide whether to believe her or whether he'd seen enough of people like her to know when they were lying. His lips curled into a smirk, the corners of his eyes tightening with suspicion. "You're saying that I was about to drink poison?" His voice dropped to a near whisper, laced with a quiet threat. The disbelief was real, but beneath it, there was something darker, a hint of recognition, as if he had lived through enough schemes to spot one when it was laid bare in front of him. Dora didn't answer immediately. Her mind raced. She needed to be careful, to tread carefully in these waters. She couldn't afford to lie outright, not when he was looking at her like that, as if trying to see through her into the very depths of her soul. But she couldn't afford to back down either. If she did, she might as well be signing her own death sentence. "Cyanide," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving his. "It's undetectable to most people, but not to me. I can smell it. There." The truth, simple and direct. Dora was no stranger to danger, but something about this moment, this man, felt like it was playing in a different league. One wrong move, and she would be nothing but another body in a long line of casualties. She could see it in his eyes, the flicker of calculation. Geraldo wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a strategist, someone who saw every action as part of a much larger picture. Geraldo let out a low chuckle, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. He sat back, crossing his arms over his chest, as if considering something. The tension in the air was suffocating. Dora waited, heart hammering in her chest, afraid to even blink. "You really expect me to believe you?" Geraldo's words were heavy with incredulity. His posture shifted slightly, and for the first time since she'd intercepted the glass, she felt him relax, just a fraction. "You think I'm some kind of fool? Some target for whoever's got a problem with me?" Dora didn't flinch. She couldn't. She had no choice now but to ride this wave and hope she didn't get drowned in it. "I'm just a bartender," she said, her voice low. "I've got nothing to gain from lying to you, but I do know a thing or two about poisons." The words hung between them, thick with unspoken implications. Her heart continued to race, but now the weight of what she'd done began to settle in. She had intervened in something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Her father's lessons had prepared her for moments like this, but standing here, with Geraldo Arcuri, the infamous mafia boss, looking at her as though he might destroy her with a single glance, it was more real than any textbook lesson ever could have been. He looked down at the glass, his eyes narrowing. He didn't reach for it again. Instead, he sat in silence for several moments, as if weighing the situation in his mind. Dora couldn't read him. She wasn't sure if that made it worse or better. Finally, Geraldo spoke again, his voice calmer, but still filled with that calculating edge. "You know, I could have you thrown out of here for what you just done." His eyes met hers, intense. like the gaze of a predator sizing up its prey. "Hell, I could have you killed." Dora didn't blink. She couldn't let him see her fear, even though it was crawling under her skin. "Then do it," she said, surprising even herself with the sharpness of her words. "But first, you'll have to figure out who tried to kill you." Geraldo leaned back in his chair, the chair creaking under his weight. He looked at her with a mixture of amusement and caution. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But tell me this, bartender. Why should I believe you? How do I know you're not part of whatever game is being played here?" Dora felt the weight of his question settle in her chest. She didn't have an answer, not a simple one, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever was going on, whatever game was being played, she was now part of it. There was no turning back. "Not now. Because I can smell it," she said again, quieter this time, her eyes unwavering. "I know what's in that glass." For a long moment, Geraldo stared at her. His gaze was cold, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something that made Dora's stomach churn. It wasn't just suspicion. It was a kind of recognition, a quiet understanding that she had just shown him something he couldn't ignore. And just like that, the conversation shifted. He leaned forward, the smallest of smiles tugging at his lips. "All right, bartender. I'll let you explain. But don't think for a second that this means I trust you." Dora exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. But just as quickly, the reality of the situation hit her again. Geraldo wasn't a man who trusted easily, and he certainly wasn't a man who forgave quickly. The game had begun, and she had no idea how deep it ran. Dora's pulse raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she leaned against the bar, the cool wood grounding her in the midst of the storm swirling in her chest. Her mind raced with the weight of the moment. Geraldo Arcuri, a man who could have anyone killed without a second thought, was sitting just a few feet away from her. She had crossed the line. There was no going back now. But what unsettled her most wasn't the Mafia boss sitting at the table. It wasn't the wine she had intercepted or the life she had saved, or, rather, prevented from ending, with a simple act of defiance. It was the nagging feeling at the back of her mind, the one she had tried to ignore for years. The one that had always hovered over her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Her father. Dora closed her eyes for a moment, the memories flooding back like an unwelcome tide. Her father had been a chemist, a brilliant one at that. A man who could identify toxins and poisons with nothing more than a sniff. A man who understood the hidden dangers in everyday life. It was from him that Dora had inherited her sharp sense of smell, a gift she had never fully appreciated until tonight. But her father hadn't just worked with medical professionals or private clients. He had consulted for businesses, too. And not just any businesses. Some of the companies he worked for had ties to the underworld. Criminal enterprises, shadowy figures who existed just beyond the light of the law. She had never liked to admit it, but deep down, she knew. Her father had been involved in things he shouldn't have been. Things that led to his death. The night he died had been a blur of confusion. It was ruled an accident, a tragic slip in his lap. But Dora had never believed that. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. She had been only a child when it happened, too young to understand the full scope of what had transpired, but old enough to sense that something was wrong. The authorities had closed the case quickly, labeling it a freak accident, a slip of the hand that caused a deadly spill of chemicals. But Dora had always suspected foul play, and as the years passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that her father's death hadn't been an accident at all, that someone had wanted him gone, someone who needed him silenced. Her thoughts shifted back to the present, to Geraldo Arcuri. He had been sitting at the bar, calm, composed, dangerous. It was impossible to ignore the eerie similarities between his world and the one her father had been part of. The connection was too obvious to overlook. Arcuri's organization, his power, his empire, was built on the same kind of criminal foundations that her father had worked with. Was it possible that Geraldo's Mafia had something to do with her father's death? Was she standing in front of the man who could have had her father killed? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Arcuri was a shadow from her past, a connection to everything she had tried to escape. The more she tried to convince herself it was just paranoia, the more certain she became. There was no way this was a coincidence. There was no way Geraldo Arcuri wasn't involved in some way. But how? And why? Dora had been running from the past for years, trying to bury the painful memories of that night. She had distanced herself from the life her father had led, throwing herself into her work at the bar, hoping it would shield her from the darkness. She had always told herself that she was just a bartender, nothing more. That her job didn't make her part of the world her father had been a part of. She had kept her head down, kept to herself, and hoped that if she played her part well enough, the past would stay buried. But now, standing in front of Arcuri, she couldn't pretend any longer. He was a man tied to that world, her father's world, and she was tangled up in it now. The threads had been pulled, and there was no untangling them. A shiver ran down her spine as she thought about the possibility. What if Arcuri had been behind her father's death? What if his Mafia had been the ones to take him out, just to cover their tracks? Her breath hitched as she forced herself to think back to that night, to the hospital, to the moment when she had seen her father lying in that sterile bed, pale and lifeless. The unanswered questions had haunted her for years. What had her father been working on? What had he known that made him a threat to someone powerful? She had always wondered, but now, standing here with Geraldo Arcuri, so close, the pieces began to fit together. As the realization hit her, Dora's gaze flickered back to Arcuri, who was still sitting at the table, his eyes never leaving her. She could feel his gaze, cold and calculating, as if he was reading her every move. He knew something. She could see it in the way his lips curled into a knowing smirk. She was certain he was aware that she knew more than she had let on. Her thoughts were interrupted as Geraldo's voice cut through the tension, smooth and calm, but with an unmistakable edge of danger. "You know, I'm beginning to wonder if I made a mistake," he said, his voice carrying across the bar. "You got a sharp eye, a keen sense of smell. I wonder if that's all you've inherited from your father." Dora froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as his words sunk in. He knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, keeping her tone steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was lying to him or to herself anymore. Geraldo chuckled, the sound dark and knowing. "Oh, I think you do. You've got the look in your eyes, the same one your father had before things got messy. The same look that told me he knew too much. He wasn't just some chemist, was he? No. Your father had his hands in things he shouldn't have. And now you just like him." Dora's pulse quickened. "You're wrong," she managed to say, her voice low and sharp. "I'm nothing like him." Geraldo tilted his head slightly, his smile widening. "I'm not so sure about that, Dora. You're standing in front of me, making a choice. The same choice your father made. You're involved now, whether you like it or not." The words hit Dora like a punch to the gut. She had tried to deny it for years, tried to convince herself that she was just a simple bartender, far removed from the world her father had been a part of. But here she was, with Geraldo Arcuri, a man whose very presence sent a shiver down her spine, and she was a part of something far darker than she had ever imagined. She wasn't running anymore. She couldn't, and the realization settled in her gut like a heavy stone. The answers she had been searching for about her father's death were buried deep in the world Geraldo Arcuri controlled. And now, she was tangled up in it. The days after that fateful night at the bar blurred into one long, tense stretch of time. Dora moved through her shifts mechanically, serving drinks, pouring wine, and pretending that everything was normal. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Each click of the glasses, each faint rustle of conversation in the background, only reminded her that she had crossed a line. That one moment of reaching out and stopping Geraldo's toast had set something into motion that she couldn't undo. Dora couldn't get the look in his eyes out of her head. That knowing look. He hadn't trusted her, of course. She knew that much. But there was something else in his gaze, something that made her wonder if he had been testing her all along. And she knew that testing her hadn't been a casual decision. It was deliberate. The thought made her feel like a pawn in a game she didn't even fully understand yet. And so, she did what she always did when things became too much to handle. She took action. After work each night, Dora sat in her small apartment, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating her notes and printouts. She'd started digging into Geraldo Arcuri's business dealings, gathering any scraps of information she could find. It wasn't much at first, just a handful of articles, some business reports, and a few whispers in the shadows. But the more she searched, the more she began to understand the scope of Arcuri's empire. On the surface, Geraldo's businesses appeared legitimate. A few high-end restaurants, some real estate investments, even a string of private security firms. But Dora knew better than to take things at face value. Her father had worked with these kinds of businesses for years, consulting for companies whose owners hid their criminal activities behind shiny facades. It wasn't hard to spot the pattern once she started looking. Arcuri's organizations were built on a complex web of fronts. Restaurants that secretly laundered money, real estate that was used to move illicit goods, and security firms that had shady dealings with clients too powerful to question. Dora's stomach churned as she pieced it all together. Arcuri wasn't just a mafia boss. He was the head of a far-reaching, multifaceted criminal network. The kind of network that didn't leave loose ends. And Dora had just become one. Her investigation dug deeper with each passing day, and with each new discovery, the danger around her seemed to grow. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a strange phone call that hung up as soon as she answered. But the signs soon became harder to ignore. Dora began to feel eyes on her, following her every step. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the invisible hand of Arcuri's organization was closing in around her. Her life had shifted from normal to under constant surveillance, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stay ahead of it. The tension crept up on her like a thick fog, filling the space around her until she could barely breathe. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. Every new piece of information she uncovered only seemed to lead her down a darker path, one that made her question her every move. One night, as she sat hunched over her laptop, scrolling through another set of documents she had pulled from shady database, Dora found something that made her freeze. The poisoning. It wasn't meant for Geraldo. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reread the document several times. It was a corporate report detailing a potential partnership between Arcuri and a man named Douglas Harmon, a corporate figure with ties to Arcuri's businesses. Harmon was in charge of one of the largest construction firms in the city and had been working closely with Arcuri on several high-profile projects. But according to the documents, Harmon had been secretly plotting to double-cross Arcuri. There were meetings scheduled with rival organizations, shady backdoor deals involving stolen assets, and a series of communications that painted Harmon as a liability. It wasn't just business, it was betrayal, and it had been going on for months. The poisoning attempt on Geraldo had been a cover. The glass of wine, the one she had stopped from reaching his lips, had been meant for Harmon, not Geraldo. The plot had been designed to look like an accident, a slip-up in a high-stakes business dinner. But it had been orchestrated to take out Harmon quietly and efficiently. Dora's stomach twisted at the thought. Whoever had orchestrated the plan had made it so clean, so seamless, that even she had almost missed it. But now everything made sense. The tension in the restaurant, the odd silence in the air, the way Arcuri had almost accepted the glass, as if it were nothing more than part of the ritual. He hadn't been the target. His associates, those in his inner circle, had been playing a game of their own, and he had been too distracted to see it coming. Dora closed the laptop slowly, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Arcuri's empire wasn't just dangerous. It was deadly in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. And Harmon wasn't the only one who had been playing a dangerous game. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the desk. The investigation was no longer just about her father's death. It was about Arcuri, about the secret lives and deadly games being played right on her nose. She was deeper into the web than she'd ever imagined, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Dora's phone rang, cutting through the stillness of the room. She grabbed it quickly, her heart racing as she recognized the number on the screen. It was him, Geraldo. The words on the tip of her tongue froze. She knew she had no choice but to answer. She had uncovered too much, And now, the game had reached its final stage. Dora. Geraldo's voice came through the line, smooth and calculated. I think it's time we had a little chat. I'm sure you've been busy, looking into things, but I'd like to know exactly what you've learned. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't back out now. Whatever game she was playing, it had just gotten far more dangerous. I'm listening, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Geraldo chuckled, the sound dark and knowing. Good. I think you'll find the next move interesting. As the phone went dead, Dora's mind raced. The deeper she dug, the more dangerous the game became. And now, Geraldo Arcuri was playing her like a pawn on a chessboard. She had no idea what her next move would be, but she knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. The web had caught her, and now she had to decide whether to escape or get tangled up in it for good. Dora couldn't ignore the feeling that something was closing in on her. The deeper she dug into Arcuri's world, the more she found herself in the line of fire. The investigation into her father's death, the poisoning plot, the growing tension between Arcuri and his associates. It was all leading her into dangerous territory. Every step she took seemed to pull her further into a place where escape was no longer an option. As the days wore on, Dora found herself feeling more isolated. The familiar hum of the bar, the routine of her shifts, all seemed like a distant memory. Her life had shifted, and with it, her world had become darker, more complicated. She couldn't look at Geraldo Arcuri the same way anymore. What had seemed like a dangerous man in the shadows had become a looming figure, pulling strings she couldn't see. One evening, as Dora wiped down the bar, preparing for the late-night rush, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Something's bothering you, isn't it? She turned to find her regular patron leaning against the counter, his drink barely touched, his eyes studying her with a knowing look. The man was older, probably in his mid-60s, with silver hair and a weathered face. He was the kind of person you didn't notice unless you were looking for him. Unassuming, almost invisible in a room full of more colorful characters. Yet there was something about him that had always seemed off. Dora couldn't put her finger on it, but she had always felt a quiet unease around him. Is it that obvious? Dora asked, managing a half-smile as she reached for a clean cloth. The man's lips twitched, a hint of a smile breaking through his serious demeanor. I've seen that look before. It's the look of someone trying to bury something, or someone who's found themselves in way too deep. Either way, it's a look that doesn't lie. Dora paused, her hand still on the cloth. She had always kept her distance from him, not out of fear, but out of instinct. There was something about the way he carried himself, the quiet manner in which he observed the world, that made her think he knew more than he let on. Who are you? She asked, her voice lower now, the edge of curiosity in her tone. Really? The man took a sip of his drink, then leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice to match hers. Name's Tony, he said simply, watching her closely. But that's not what you want to know, is it? Dora's pulse quickened. She knew that look, the one that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Tony had seen something in her, something she wasn't ready to face. It made her uneasy, but part of her was also drawn in, as if some invisible thread was pulling her toward the truth. I've been watching you, Dora, Tony continued, his voice soft but carrying an undertone of something far heavier. I know what you're doing. Digging around, asking questions you shouldn't be asking. Dora stiffened. Her suspicions about him had been right all along, but hearing him confirm it out loud made her heart race. What do you mean? What do you know? Tony's eyes flickered briefly to the bar's front door, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he leaned in even closer, his breath warm against her ear. I used to be in the business, he whispered. The kind of business your friend Geraldo runs. He paused, watching Dora's reaction. I used to be a hitman. Dora's breath caught in her throat. The words didn't seem to sink in at first. It was as if her mind couldn't quite process the enormity of what he was saying. Oh, you were a hitman? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Tony nodded, his expression grim. Retired now, of course. I don't do that kind of work anymore. But I've seen enough to know when something's about to go down. And I can see what's happening to you. You're in danger, whether you realize it or not. Dora shook her head slowly, trying to digest the flood of information. Why are you telling me this? Tony's gaze softened, a flicker of sympathy passing through his eyes. Because I can help you, he said, and because you're in deeper than you know. Dora opened her mouth to protest, but Tony raised a hand, stopping her. I'm not asking for anything in return, not yet anyway. But you need to understand, the more you dig into Arkuri's world, the more dangerous it's going to get. There are people watching you, and not just Geraldo. His enemies, they know you're asking questions. Dora's mind raced. She had known she was in danger, but hearing Tony's words made the reality of her situation feel far more real, far more immediate. She had thought she could handle it, thought she could navigate this dangerous world without getting caught in the crossfire. But now, Tony's words hit her like a ton of bricks. She swallowed hard. So what do you want from me? Tony's eyes darkened. Nothing right now, but I'm offering you protection. You've already made the decision to keep digging, but you're not going to get very far on your own. Trust me, the people who are after you don't play by the same rules. Dora stared at him for a long moment, weighing her options. She had always tried to avoid this world, the one her father had been a part of. She had wanted to build a life free from the shadows of the past, but the truth was staring her in the face now. Arkuri was too deeply connected to her father's death, and the Mafia was far more tangled up in everything than she had ever realized. Finally, Dora exhaled, her decision weighing heavily on her shoulders. All right, she said quietly, her voice steady. I'll take your help, but I need to know everything. I can't keep doing this halfway. Tony's lips curled into a faint smile. That's the spirit. You've got guts, Dora. I respect that. He stood up, leaving a tip on the bar before turning to leave. We'll talk more later, he said, his voice carrying a quiet urgency. But don't trust anyone in our Arkuri circle. Not even him. Dora watched him leave, her mind spinning with the enormity of her decision. She had made the choice to stay in the game, to continue her investigation into her father's death and Arkuri's criminal empire. But now, with Tony's offer of protection, she was more entangled in the world of danger and betrayal than ever before. The realization hit her all at once. She was no longer a spectator. She was part of the game. Her phone buzzed suddenly, breaking her thoughts. Dora glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening when she saw the name, Geraldo Arkuri. There was no turning back now. There was no turning back now. Dora stood frozen for a moment, her finger hovering over the answer button. Her heart thudded in her chest as the weight of the decision pressed down on her. For a second, she considered letting it go to voicemail, pretending like she hadn't seen it. But she couldn't. She was already too far in. She had already chosen to confront the dangerous world Geraldo Arkuri was part of. Taking a deep breath, Dora pressed the button and brought the phone to her ear. She was barely able to steady her nerves, but she knew she had to sound calm. He wouldn't respect weakness. Dora. Geraldo's voice came through the line, smooth, calculated, and dripping with power. I think it's time we had a real conversation. Dora's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. I'm listening. I'm sure you've been busy, looking into things, he said, his tone cool and unbothered. But now it's time for you to hear what's really going on. Meet me in my office. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. She swallowed, her mind racing. Meeting at his office wasn't an option she had planned for, but now she had no choice. Understood, Dora said, trying to keep the wariness out of her voice. I'll be there. Geraldo's chuckle echoed through the phone, sending a shiver down her spine. Good. See you soon. The call ended, and Dora stared at the screen for a long moment. Every instinct she had screamed at her to be cautious, to tread lightly. Geraldo had a way of twisting people into his web, and she wasn't ready to be just another pawn. But she had already made her choice, and there was no going back now. Dora looked up at the clock, 11:45 p.m. She had no time to waste. She needed to prepare. The next morning, Dora met with Tony, the retired hitman, at a small cafe near the edge of town. The place was quiet, a perfect spot for conversation where nobody would be listening in. As soon as Dora sat down, Tony's eyes met hers with a knowing look, his face drawn and serious. So you're going, Tony said simply, his voice low. It wasn't a question, but a statement. He already knew her decision. I have no choice, Dora replied, her voice tight. I can't keep running from this. Tony gave her a long, assessing look before leaning in slightly. You know this is the moment, right? The moment you either walk away or get sucked deeper into this world. There's no halfway. Dora nodded, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. I know, but I can't walk away now. Not when I'm this close to the truth. Tony studied her for a long beat, then nodded in agreement. All right, then we need to make sure you're ready for whatever happens. You can't go in there unarmed. You need to understand Arkuri's world. Really understand it before you confront him. Dora leaned forward, eager to hear what Tony had to say. What I need to know. Tony's gaze turned cold. The poisoning, the one you stopped, wasn't just some random hit. This isn't about Arkuri's enemies wanting him dead. This whole thing has been carefully orchestrated from the inside. Someone close to him, someone he trusts, is trying to bring him down. And the people behind it don't care who gets hurt in the process. You included. Dora's breath caught in her throat. Who? I don't know yet, Tony said, his voice low and full of uncertainty. But I know the people involved. I know how they operate. And they've been feeding Arkuri false information, setting him up to fail. The poisoning was just the first step. Dora's mind raced as she processed Tony's words. She had suspected that Arkuri's empire was more fragile than it appeared, but hearing it confirmed filled her with a cold dread. If the conspiracy was this deep, then it was bigger than just a single poisoning attempt. Tony continued, You're going to need leverage. Information. You can't just go in there guns blazing. This isn't that kind of fight. Arkuri's smart. He'll know if you're trying to play him. You need to outsmart him. And that means finding the traitor within his own organization before they find you. Dora took a deep breath. How do we do that? Tony leaned back in his chair, looking satisfied with her response. We start small. We dig into his inner circle. The guys closest to him. The ones who might have something to gain from his downfall. We find out who's pulling the strings behind the scenes. You'll be surprised what people will reveal when they think they're in the clear. The next morning, Dora arrived at Geraldo Arkuri's office, her heart pounding in her chest. The building was tall and imposing, a cold monument to the empire Geraldo had built. She walked through the lobby, trying to steady her nerves, her mind focused on what Tony had said. Find the traitor before they find you. When she entered Geraldo's office, the door clicked shut behind her, and she found herself face to face with the man who had unknowingly drawn her into this dangerous game. He sat behind a large wooden desk, his back straight, his eyes never leaving hers. Dora, he said smoothly, his voice calm and authoritative. I'm glad you came. I trust you've been busy. Dora didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him, her mind working quickly to process every detail. She had been in his presence before, but now it felt different. Now, she was no longer a passive observer. Now, she was part of the game. I've been looking into things, Dora said finally, keeping her voice steady. I think it's time we talk about the poisoning attempt, and about who might be behind it. Geraldo's eyes darkened, his fingers tapping slowly on the desk. You've been digging, haven't you? He asked, a slight edge to his voice. You should be careful. People who dig too deep don't always come out on the other side. Dora stepped closer to his desk, her eyes meeting his with a quiet defiance. You want the truth, don't you? She asked. You want to know who's betraying you, don't you? Because I can give you that. The tension in the room thickened. Geraldo remained silent for a moment, his gaze locked on her. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, the faintest of smirks curling on his lips. Tell me, he said softly, what you've found. Dora took a breath, her heart pounding. The poisoning wasn't meant for you, she said. It was meant for someone close to you. A corporate partner, someone who's been working against you. I've been digging, and I've found evidence of a conspiracy within your own organization. People you trust are setting you up to fail. Geraldo's smirk faded, replaced by an unreadable expression. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something more than anger in his eyes, something like fear. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This was what he had been hiding. The cracks in his empire. The rot from the inside. You're saying this wasn't a random attempt? Geraldo asked, his voice suddenly tight. No, Dora replied, her voice steady. This goes deeper than that, and if we don't act fast, it could bring down everything you've built. Geraldo stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I think we need to talk more about this in private. And just like that, Dora knew. The game had changed. Now they were playing for everything. Geraldo's office felt colder now, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. He was standing, his back to the massive window that overlooked the city, a sprawling, glittering landscape of power and wealth. But within these walls, in this room, there was no beauty, no luxury. Only the weight of decisions made and consequences to be faced. Dora's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground, refusing to let the nerves show. She had come this far. She couldn't back out now. I didn't expect this from you, Geraldo said, his voice low, filled with a quiet fury that seemed to vibrate through the room. His gaze was sharp, like a predator's eyes locked on its prey. His words, though calm, carried the weight of something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. You think you're just playing a game? That you can pull at the threads of my empire and walk away unscathed? His words were punctuated with a cold finality that made her breath catch. I should have known better than to let you get this close. Dora's stomach twisted. She had known that confronting Geraldo would lead to this moment. The moment where the lines between truth and betrayal blurred. But she hadn't expected him to turn on her so quickly, so completely. I haven't betrayed you, she said, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of uncertainty. I'm just trying to understand what's happening. Why did you order the poisoning attempt on yourself? Why is everyone playing games behind your back? Geraldo's eyes hardened. It wasn't meant to be a real attempt, he said, his lips curling into a small, bitter smile. It was a test, a way to see who would turn on me, who could be trusted. I knew someone was playing me from the inside. The poisoning? It wasn't about me. It was a test to see how far this betrayal went. Dora's mind raced. A test? The poisoning wasn't meant to kill him? So, you set up? She asked, disbelief creeping in her voice. You had it planned all along. Geraldo nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her. Yes, but I didn't expect you to get involved. I certainly didn't expect you to stop it. His eyes narrowed, and the air between them thickened. You've been digging, Dora, asking questions you shouldn't. And now, I'm wondering just how much you really know. The realization hit her with the force of a punch. Geraldo had orchestrated the poisoning attempt as a test of loyalty. And now, because of her involvement, she was part of the very scheme she had been trying to unravel. The lines between right and wrong, truth and deception, had become so blurred that Dora wasn't sure where she stood anymore. Dora opened her mouth to speak, but Geraldo silenced her with a raised hand. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cold calculation. I thought you were just a bartender, Dora, he continued, his voice smooth and controlled. I didn't expect you to have the nerve to get involved in something like this. But now you've gone too far. You've crossed a line. You can't walk away from this. The weight of his words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had thought that if she kept pushing, if she kept searching for the truth about her father's death and Arkori's organization, she could make a difference. But now it felt like she had become part of something far bigger, something darker. There was no easy way out anymore. Geraldo took a step closer to her, his gaze fixed on her with a chilling intensity. You've learned too much, Dora, and now you need to decide. Are you going to keep digging, or are you going to walk away before things get even messy, eh? Dora's heart hammered at her chest. She had never felt so caught between two worlds, two choices that would define everything. She could leave now, return to her life, to the safety she had once taken for granted. She could put the investigation behind her, step away from the dangerous game Geraldo had drawn her into. But that would mean walking away from the truth about her father's death, the truth about the Mafia's corruption, the truth about Arkori's empire. But could she keep going? Could she keep fighting when she knew that every step forward brought her deeper into the web Geraldo had woven? She glanced at Geraldo, his face impassive as he waited for her answer, and felt a wave of disgust rise in her throat. He had used her, played her like a pawn, and now he was offering her a choice. A choice to stay in the game, to become part of the system that had taken everything from her. She knew the consequences of staying. She knew the danger, the lies, and the betrayal that lay ahead. But she also knew that walking away meant never getting the answer she needed, never exposing the truth about her father's death. And so, Dora made her decision. "I'm not walking away," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I'm going to finish this. I'm going to find out who's behind this, who's behind the poisoning, behind my father's death, and I'm going to make sure they're held accountable." Geraldo's eyes narrowed, as if he hadn't expected her to say those words. For a moment, the tension between them hung heavy, thick with the weight of their unspoken understanding. Then, Geraldo smirked, a glint of something dangerous flashing in his eyes. "You've made your choice, then," he said softly. "But remember, Dora, when you step into this world, there's no going back. Once you're in for good. And there's no telling who you'll lose along the way." The words hung in the air like a warning, a final threat. Dora's stomach churned, but she didn't back down. She couldn't, not when she was so close to the truth. Not when her father's death, the mystery behind it, was still haunting her. She couldn't let it go. Geraldo stepped back, his gaze still fixed on her. "Very well," he said, his voice laced with a dark amusement. "Let's see how this all plays out, then. You need to be careful, Dora. There's a lot more at stake now than you realize." Dora nodded, her mind made up. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." Geraldo's smile was cold, calculating. "We'll see, won't we?" As Dora left his office, the weight of the decision settled heavily on her shoulders. She had chosen to stay in the game, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But deep down, she knew one thing for sure. Nothing about this would be easy. And the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous the game would become. The pieces were falling into place. And now, there was no turning back. Dora sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the mess of documents spread across her desk. The names, dates, and connections she had painstakingly uncovered over the past few weeks blurred together in her mind. Every lead, every clue she had followed led her closer to the same terrifying conclusion. The conspiracy within Geraldo Arcuri's empire ran deeper than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just the Mafia's outward operations, the shady businesses, and the hidden deals. The real corruption was in the very core of his organization. People Arcuri trusted, people he thought were loyal, had been working behind his back, pulling strings to take him down. But why? What did they have to gain? As Dora's eyes scanned the final piece of the puzzle, a company ledger she had stolen from one of Arcuri's associates, she saw the name again, Douglas Harmon, the corporate partner she had learned about days earlier. But now, there was something more, an address, a meeting place. This was it, the moment of truth. She knew she couldn't face Geraldo alone. Not anymore. Her involvement had already cost her any semblance of safety. But she wasn't alone in this fight. Tony, the retired hitman, had become an unlikely ally. His knowledge of the Mafia's inner workings and his connections had provided her with the tools she needed to take down the conspiracy. She couldn't afford to waste time. The confrontation was coming, and she needed to be ready. Tony had set the plan in motion. He had contacts who could provide her with the information she needed to expose the true mastermind behind the poisoning. But now, she had to make her move or risk losing everything. The sun had barely set when Dora met Tony in the shadow of a dimly lit alleyway, away from the prying eyes of Arcuri's associates. His expression was grim, the usual casual demeanor replaced by a sense of urgency. "You ready for this?" Tony asked, his voice low and steady. He didn't need to ask her twice. Dora had made her decision days ago, but the weight of it still hung over her like a storm cloud. "I have to be," Dora replied, her jaw set with determination. "If we don't do this now, everything we've uncovered will be buried, and I'll never get the answers I need." Tony nodded, his face a mask of experience. "Just remember, this isn't just about exposing Arcuri. It's about surviving long enough to take him down. You got to keep your head cool." Dora exhaled sharply, steeling herself. She wasn't sure what this confrontation would bring, but she knew one thing. She had come too far to turn back now. They made their way to a small, inconspicuous building in a part of town that seemed to have been forgotten by the world. The address from Harmon's ledger had led them here. Dora's hand tightened around the strap of her bag, where she'd concealed the evidence. The smoking gun that would finally expose the corruption within Arcuri's empire. Tony had scouted the area earlier, and now the time had come. He nodded at her, signaling that they were ready. With a deep breath, Dora pushed open the door, stepping into the dark, musty room. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and something far more sinister hung in the air. Inside, a few shadows moved around the corners, but the center of the room was empty. The tension crackled in the air like static, and Dora's eyes flicked to the back, where two figures emerged from the shadows. Douglas Harmon, and a man she didn't recognize. Harmon's face was as cold as the city's steel towers, his sharp features barely hiding the menace beneath. He was the last person Dora had expected to find here. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized that Harmon had been playing his own game all along, working behind Arcuri's back, sowing the seeds of distrust within the organization. "Dora," Harmon said smoothly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of amusement. "I wonder when you'd show up." She kept her gaze steady, refusing to show any weakness. "You've been behind this from the start, haven't you? You orchestrated the poisoning attempt on Geraldo, but you didn't count on me getting involved." The man beside Harmon stepped forward, a hulking figure with a face like stone. Dora recognized him now, one of Arcuri's trusted enforcers. He was the one who had been keeping an eye on her, following her every move. And now, here he was standing beside Harmon. "It was never about Arcuri," Harmon said, his smile turning into a sneer. "It's about control, about taking what's mine. Arcuri's empire was supposed to be mine, but the fool doesn't know when to step aside." Dora's stomach churned. The betrayal stung, but she couldn't let it show. She had known Arcuri's empire was crumbling, but this was bigger than anything she had imagined. "You thought you could manipulate him, get rid of him, and take over. And you almost succeeded. But you underestimated me," Dora said, her voice calm, though her mind raced. Harmon's eyes narrowed. "You've been digging, haven't you? You found too much. But it's too late. There's no going back now." Before Dora could respond, a sudden crash rang out, followed by the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. The enforcer lunged at her, but Tony was already moving, his speed a blur. With one swift motion, he knocked the enforcer aside, sending him crashing into the wall. Dora's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what was happening. The confrontation had just escalated. The room erupted into chaos as Tony and the enforcer clashed, but Dora's focus remained on Harmon. She couldn't lose him now, not when she was so close. "You thought you could hide behind your power, Harmon," Dora said, stepping toward him. "But you're just as corrupt as the rest of them. You've been using Arcuri's empire as your own personal playground, and now it's over." Harmon's eyes flickered with something, rage, maybe, or fear. But before he could speak, a loud crack echoed through the room. The enforcer, now unconscious on the floor, wasn't the only one to fall. Harmon staggered, his hand flying to his chest, where blood began to seep through his shirt. Dora's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Tony had fired. The betrayal ran deep, but this was something else entirely. "Get out of here, Dora," Tony said, his voice harsh. "Now." But Dora didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind was still processing what had just happened. The fight had shifted, and the final confrontation had begun. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady, resolved. She wasn't backing down. Not now. With one final move, Dora stepped forward, her heart racing as she confronted the real mastermind behind the plot. The Mafia's power structure was crumbling, and she had the final piece in her hand. And as the room fell silent once more, Dora knew that the empire was beginning to unravel. No longer just a story of betrayal and poison, but of justice and retribution. The game was over. The weight of it all settled in like a heavy fog, thickening the air around her. The loud crash of Harmon's body hitting the floor seemed to reverberate in her chest, a brutal reminder of how far she had come and how much she had sacrificed. The chaos, the the lies, the twisted labyrinth of corruption. It was all coming to an end. But at what cost? Dora stood in the center of the room, her breathing slow but steady, her eyes scanning the wreckage of what had once been an impenetrable fortress. The betrayal she had witnessed, the people she had trusted, and the choices she had made. It all seemed so surreal now. She could feel the echoes of the violence around her, like a lingering shadow she couldn't shake off. Tony stood across from her, his expression unreadable. The enforcer, Harmon's partner in the scheme, lay motionless on the floor, a testament to the power struggle that had just unfolded. Dora's hands were still trembling, the weight of the gun in her bag a constant reminder of the fine line she had walked between right and wrong. "I didn't think it would end like this," Dora said, her voice quiet, almost to herself. "I didn't think any of this would happen." Tony's gaze softened, though his face remained stoic. "That's the thing about this world, kid. You never know how it'll end, but it's the choices you make along the way that matter." He paused, then added, "You chose to fight for the truth. That's something not many people are willing to do." Dora didn't answer right away. She could feel the weight of the words, the reality of them sinking in. She had started this journey searching for justice for her father, for the truth about his death, and now she had found herself caught in a world of lies, betrayals, and violence. She had crossed lines she never thought she would, and now, standing in the remains of the empire she had helped tear down, she realized there was no going back. The man she had once feared, the one who had controlled so much of her fate, Geraldo Arcuri, was no longer the threat he had once been. His empire was crumbling, his allies scattered, his enemies rising. But for Dora, the victory fell hollow. She had won, but she had lost so much along the way. "What happens now?" Dora asked, her voice almost a whisper. Tony gave her a measured look, his eyes dark with understanding. "Now you move on. The game's over, but the world doesn't stop turning. You got a choice to make. You can walk away from all this, start fresh, live a life that's yours again. Or you can keep fighting, keep digging, keep chasing justice. But just remember, the cost of justice in this world is steep, and the price of knowing too much is even higher." Dora's mind churned as she thought about the path ahead. The life she had once known, the simple life of serving drinks at the bar, was no longer an option. The person she had been before, the one who could live with a sense of quiet normalcy, no longer existed. She had been changed by this world, by the choices she had made, and by the people she had met along the way. She had already sacrificed so much, her peace of mind, her sense of safety, and, most importantly, the innocence with which she had once viewed the world. The Mafia was a machine that could not be stopped easily. Even though she had helped bring down part of it, she knew it was still lurking in the shadows. Arcuri's empire might have crumbled, but there were always more players, more schemers, more dangerous games to be played. But the thing that weighed most heavily on her heart was the truth she had uncovered about her father. The realization that his death had been tied to a much bigger world than she had ever imagined. The secrets she had learned, the people she had confronted, and the pieces of the puzzle she had put together had given her something that would last beyond this victory. The knowledge that her father's death had not been in vain. The truth had been worth the fight, and for that, she would always be grateful. "Whatever happens," Dora said finally, looking up at Tony, "I won't forget why I started this. My father's death, the poisoning, the lies. I'll carry those with me, but I won't let it define me. I won't let it control me." Tony nodded, his expression softening. "That's the right choice. You've got the strength to make it through, Dora. You just need to remember who you are and who you want to be." Dora stood still for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. She had spent so long running from her past, from the life her father had led. She had tried to bury it, to move on, but the truth had a way of catching up with you. Now, she had to decide what to do with that truth. She could keep running, hide from it, or she could face it head on and carve out a new path for herself. The truth would always be a part of her, but it didn't have to define her. "Thank you," Dora said, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "For everything." Tony gave her a small nod, acknowledging the gravity of her decision. You've done what needed to be done. Now it's time for you to decide what comes next. Dora turned, her eyes scanning the wreckage of the once mighty Mafia empire. It was a mess, a crumbling structure built on lies and violence. She had been caught in its web, but now she had the freedom to choose what happened next. As she walked away, her mind cleared, the weight of the past slowly lifting. There would be consequences for her actions, but Dora wasn't afraid anymore. She had taken a stand, and now she would face whatever came her way with the same courage and determination that had brought her this far. In the distance, the city stretched out before her, vast, uncertain, but full of possibilities. The world was still full of deception, but Dora had learned the true cost of pursuing justice in a world built on power struggles. She knew the dangers, but she also knew she had the strength to navigate them. With her father's memory guiding her, she looked ahead, ready to make her mark on the world, on her own terms. Dora's involvement with the Mafia might not have ended with Geraldo Arcuri's downfall, but she was no longer the same woman who had walked into that world. She had seen its darkness, its corruption, and its betrayals, and she had emerged, scarred but resolute, with a new understanding of the price of justice. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Dora felt like she had a chance to rebuild, to take control of her own life. The game was over. The truth had been exposed, and now she could move forward. The world was hers to navigate, and this time she was in control.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.